627 is the invitation song of the sequence.
Hey Jack, should really learn to clean up after yourself here. Good evening. I'll put my mic on. Yes, sorry. That one's on me. Okay. It's good to be here with you all. First week is done, out of the way. It feels good to be here. I was talking to somebody and they're asking me how I'm doing with the transition and being in a new place and a new congregation. And I said, you know what? I feel like I'm home. So, and I really do. And I just feel like this is such an easy group to get along with. And I've been welcomed immediately, and that has made my transition very, very easy. And so I just want to say thank you and just express my appreciation towards you for that. And if you're here visiting this evening, we appreciate your attendance, and we are happy to have you here. And we just want to get to know you more, so please feel free to stick around. And if you're new here and you haven't visited here before, just know that all we're trying to do is what the Bible tells us to do, no more, no less. We're trying to be New Testament Christians, and we're not perfect at that, but we try to do the very best that we can. And so we appreciate you being here, and like I said, please feel free to stick around so we can get to know you better afterwards. You know, it's interesting, this happened a few times when I was in the training program where Brent would preach something and I would preach something, we wouldn't communicate at all, but they would kind of complement each other somewhat well. And so I think that's kind of what happened this morning with Jack's sermon as he preached on being called and being willing to be whatever God has called us to be, and being willing to abandon whatever we need to abandon in order to follow Him, just not letting anything get in the way. And so this evening I'm talking to you about surrendering all to Jesus. You know, if you type that word surrender into Google, the first definition that pops up is a verb. It means cease resistance to an enemy or opponent and submit to their authority. That word surrender, it has a certain connotation to it, doesn't it? As Americans, perhaps this is a word that we don't like. When you type in quotes on surrender into Google, you'll find a few things. I found one by John McCain here. He says, "Do not yield, do not flinch, stand up with our president and fight. We're Americans, and we'll never surrender." They will. You have Winston Churchill, and he says, "We shall defend our island whatever the cost may be," in a speech. And he says, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." That's from Winston Churchill. And this next one that I'm going to pull up is what we would refer to as a deep cut. So if you get this next reference, please come talk to me. But Commander Peter Quincy Taggart says, "Never give up, never surrender." And that was a character portrayed by Tim Allen in the movie Galaxy Quest. So. The point I'm trying to make is that this word surrender is never something that we're encouraged to do. And yet we sing this song, "I surrender all." You know, you won't find that exact quote in the Bible, "I surrender all," or "all to Jesus, I surrender." But the idea is there throughout. There's a few verses that I can think of specifically, but the one that I want to focus on this evening is the one that came immediately to mind for me, is found in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. Where Paul writes in the Galatians and says, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. In the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." Paul is essentially saying, I surrender all. But again, this is a word that we're not often encouraged to use. It's a word that is seen as a sign of weakness, as we often think about it on the battleground and the enemy waving the white flag, and it means that they lost. But for Christians, the idea is there that we need to be willing to surrender all to Christ. And so you'll notice in that song, if you flip your songbooks open to song number 29, back to All to Him, or All to Jesus I Surrender, we're going to take a few quotes from verses 1, 2, and 3, and we're just going to make points out of that, and we're going to make application. And you'll notice in verse 1, at one point it says, all to Him I freely give. How do we surrender all to Christ? We have to be willing to freely give all of ourselves to God. What exactly does that mean? Well, for starters, it means that we're surrendering our time. Starting with prayer. That's one of the themes here at this congregation, as I understand it, this year, is prayer. The fact is that prayer takes time, doesn't it? It takes time out of our day. And I would submit to you that it takes planning if we're going to be diligent at it. Our days are unpredictable and crazy, and sometimes we just have to put it on our schedule and hold ourselves to that schedule. And I know I made the point before, but that's what Daniel did. 3 times a day. It doesn't matter if he was going to be threatened to be eaten by lions. He was going to pray 3 times a day, and he took time out of his day each and every day to do that. But perhaps you're sitting there and you're thinking, surely Sam isn't suggesting that we surrender all of our time in prayer. Well, you know the command is that we pray without ceasing. But no, I'm not suggesting that all we do is pray. We wouldn't be able to get anything done. God wants us to be there for our families. He wants us to go about our days. He wants us to be hard workers. But what I am suggesting is that we are to surrender all of our time to God. And when I say that, you might take a step back and say, hold on, Sam, what are you talking about? And I think the reason we think that way is because when we think about surrendering all of our time to God, we think about the big things, right? We think about worship and singing and praying. But I would submit to you that the little things are every bit as important as all those acts of worship. How about the things that we do on a daily basis? Are we considering God in them? Are we considering God when we go to school, when we go to work, when we go to the gym, when we're participating in these other recreational activities? When you go about your daily life, the question that we have to ask is, who are we? Who are we when we go to school? Who are we when we're at work? When we're at the gym? When we're home alone and nobody is there to see us? Are we Christians? Or is that a title that's only reserved for us on Sundays and Wednesdays? Is there a school you and a work you and a Sunday you? God wants a relationship with us during even the monotonous moments of our lives, during the most routine moments of our lives. Are we surrendering our time to Him? Are we Christians all the time? Or are we just Christians some of the time? We need to surrender all of our time to God and be Christians all the time. And furthermore, we need to be surrendering our interests. Paul says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. If Christ lives in us, if Christ is what our life is all about, which is really what Paul is saying. He's saying Christ is at the center of my life. How can we say Christ lives in us sincerely and still be prioritizing our own interests? There's nothing wrong with having ambitions in this world so long as they don't get in the way of our relationship with God. But Jesus says if anyone desires to come after Him, we must deny ourselves and follow Him. I like the nuance in Luke chapter 9 and verse 23 where he says the same thing, but he says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily. We have a time factor in there too. Let him take up his cross daily and follow me. In other words, we are surrendering all of our interests, and we are adopting Christ's interests as our own in everything that we do. So that it's no longer us who live, but Christ living in us. We need to be surrendering our interests and deny ourselves and follow Christ. We need to be surrendering our reservations. In what ways are you skeptical as a Christian? When I ask that question, understand that I'm not even really asking or talking from a belief or faith standpoint. I think that we all struggle in these areas from time to time. But I'm more talking from an action and commitment standpoint. Is there something keeping us from being fully committed to God? Because Paul is committed, isn't he? He says, I've been crucified with Christ. That's commitment. Does that mean that he never had struggles? No, of course not. But everything we read of Paul, his commitment to God is unwavering. Through every struggle, he was going to persist and continue to preach the gospel and spread God's word. That is what his life was all about. But even in this verse, he says, it's no longer I who live. This decision that we make to let the old man die and let Christ reign in our lives, it's not one that can be made half-heartedly, is it? Yes, sometimes we're afraid of really going for it, aren't we? But that's what being a Christian is all about. It's about going for it. It's about taking the plunge and trusting in a higher power. That's what we saw this morning. Elisha, he went for it. He cut all his ties and he went and he did what God wanted him to do. Jack also made the point of the 12 disciples abandoning their lives for 3 years. You think about the first church in Jerusalem. They sold all their possessions and had all things come. They cut all their ties and they went for it as they were believing in a higher power outside of themselves. At some point, we must make a commitment one way or the other. Even Christ said in his letter to the Laodiceans in Revelation chapter 3, verse 15 and 16, he says, I'd rather you be hot or cold, as if to say, pick one. But since you're lukewarm, I will spew you out of my mouth. This is a challenge, by the way, to Christians. Not to people who are thinking about obeying the gospel, but to people who already have. And we may say, well, I've already made that commitment, but the choice is one that we're supposed to make every day. Every day as we step onto that spiritual battlefield against Satan as he's trying to hit us with those fire arrows. Even Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, down in verse 31, in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, Paul is talking about the resurrection. He's talking about basically what's the point of our faith if there is no resurrection. And what's the point of the things that he's doing every day if there's no resurrection? And finally, he says in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 31, he says, I die every day. Are we dying every day for Christ? Are we going for it? Or are we holding back? We have to surrender our reservations. And we have to surrender our fears. Maybe the two go hand in hand. Maybe the thing that causes us to be reserved in our commitment to God is fear itself. Which is why we must surrender all our fear to God. God alone is the one whom we shall fear. We already talked about prayer, but the other theme this year is evangelism. It takes boldness to preach the gospel, doesn't it? And I'm not even talking about from the pulpit. I'm saying just to talk to somebody about God. To talk to somebody about Jesus. That takes boldness. Which is why even Paul asks the Ephesians to pray for his boldness of speech. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 19. The NIV actually says, pray also for me, that whenever I speak, words may be given me, so that I will fearlessly make known the mystery of the gospel. It takes boldness. It takes a fearlessness of man to preach the gospel. And this is incredibly important as we spread the gospel. We must pray for what Paul prays for here, that we'll have soundness of speech, that we'll be so bold to talk about God and to talk about sin and what it does to souls. Because if we're afraid to speak confidently about the gospel of Christ, that's the power of God to salvation, people notice that. Perhaps our fear of man's response sometimes trumps our fear of God. If we don't have confidence in what we're preaching, how can we expect what we're preaching to be appealing to others? They will notice if we lack confidence. Why would somebody want to believe what we believe in if they feel that we're not even confident in it ourselves? We have to be assured and open about what we believe. Because the gospel is indeed the power of God to salvation. To the Jew first and also for the Greek. And it's through this gospel that the just shall live by faith, Paul says in Romans chapter 1, 16 and 17. If we believe that, then we should have no problem sharing it. And sharing it with confidence. And it would be selfish to keep it to ourselves if it's what saves mankind. We need to surrender our fears. And the last point I'll make on this as well, it's not on here, but I kind of thought about it at the last moment because it's severely important, is that we need to be willing to surrender our plans to God. You think about what James says in James chapter 4. What does he say? He rebukes them. He says, you who are making these plans saying, we'll go here, we'll make a profit. He says, you don't even know what tomorrow holds. Your life is but a vapor. He says you could die tomorrow, essentially. In James chapter 4 and verse 15, he says, instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will do this or that. Plans are fine. We can make plans. But the problem James is addressing are those who are making plans without even thinking or considering or caring about God. We need to surrender our plans to God. And understand it's okay to make plans, but our plans are subject to God's plans. And that we don't want anything apart from His will. All to Him I freely give. We need to surrender our time, our interests, our reservations, our fears, our plans. We need to give it all to God. Basically, what we need to do is surrender control to Him and give Him everything that we can. And this is a short list. It's by no means exhaustive. But we ask the question, again, how do we do it? In the second verse in that song, in Psalm 29, it says, humbly at His feet I bow. We need to humble ourselves. Humbly at His feet I bow. It certainly does take humility. Even just to make the statement that Paul makes in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. When he says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Becoming a Christian is to admit that we are messed up and in need of a great physician. It's saying that our lives are full of wrongs that we've committed. We need God's help to make it right. And if we don't, we are sentenced to eternal condemnation. It takes humility to admit all that, doesn't it? So what do? Well, we do the only thing we can. We bow down at the feet of Him who is the source of life. We humble ourselves before our Creator, and the author of our salvation, where we can freely drink of the life-giving water which only He can provide. We have to be willing to acknowledge what Peter says in Acts chapter 2 and verse 36 when he says, let all the house of Israel know therefore, know for certain, that God has made Him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. Is Jesus both Lord and Christ in your life. It takes humility to admit that. To not only admit that or acknowledge it, but to admit that you need that in your life. Make no mistake, God made Jesus of Nazareth both Lord and Christ. Do we have the humility to acknowledge it and accept it and to walk accordingly? We need to humble ourselves before God. Sorry, I didn't testify. Secondly, we need to live by faith. Once we humble ourselves before God, we have to live and walk by faith. And this is an idea that I think as Christians and members of the church that we, and this is myself included, that we think we understand. But sometimes I wonder if we fall into the same trap that the Galatians fell into. A works-based salvation. Thinking that we must or are even capable of earning our salvation. Maybe we feel like the Pharisee praying before God in Luke chapter 18 when he says, I fast twice a week, I give tithes of all that I get. And he thanks God that he's not like that man, that tax collector standing next to him. Maybe we don't say the same things. Maybe we don't say them consciously. But maybe we say other things subconsciously. We say, I take the Lord's Supper once a week. I was baptized, I pray before my meals, I put money in the collection. We say it as if we're the ones that justify ourselves through doing these things. But again, in Romans chapter 1 and 16 and 17, Paul says it's through the gospel salvation is given. The gospel is the power of God to salvation. And it's the gospel that reveals his righteousness to us. So that we can live not of ourselves, but through faith in God. He says the just shall live by faith. No matter what we do, we cannot earn righteousness and salvation. We can only accept it as a gift and obey him accordingly. But these actions that we speak of, they're actions that flow from our faith in God. In the end, we think about Luke chapter 18, where that Pharisee was praying. Whether we realize it or not, we're like this tax collector who was standing next to him, who the Pharisee said, I'm glad I'm not like this guy. It says the tax collector was standing afar off. He wouldn't even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Jesus says, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. They both were sinners. The difference is that one realized it and the other one didn't. One realized how much he was dependent upon God's mercy and grace, and the other one didn't. If we acknowledge that we're sinners,